2010년 6월 천안함 침몰 사건 이후 한반도 위기에 대한 우려의 목소리가 커지고 있습니다. 이에 열리는 남북대치 국면의 근본적인 원인, 그리고 현재 직면하고 있는 안보 문제의 해법을 구하기 위해 매들린 올브라이트 전 미국 국무장관을 초대했습니다. 그는 지난 2000년 평양을 방문해 김정일 국방위원장과 미사일 협상을 벌였던 인물이기도 합니다. 긴박하게 돌아가는 한반도 상황에 대해 그는 어떤 해석을 하고 있는지 지금부터 함께 만나보겠습니다.
Thanks for joining us today, and especially your keynote speech at the 10th anniversary of eDaily. Thank you.
Well, I'm very glad to be with you. Thank you very much.
Actually, we have lots of questions, I want to ask, but I want to go first with some questions about Korean Peninsula security issues today. You mentioned in your book, the memoir, the former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung as one of the great democratic hero in 21st century. And you also evaluated the sunshine policy he had initiated. However, the President Lee Myung-bak, the current South Korean president, actually has been skeptical of it and now withdrew it after the sinking of South Korean warship. Do you agree on his policy for now? And then do you think sunshine policy actually failed?
Well, I think that one has to consider the time of things. When President Kim Dae-jung talked about the sunshine policy, it was in the 90s. It came after a period of time when there was the agreed framework in terms of dealing with the North Korean issues, and I think it was a very important initiative. And President Kim Dae-jung himself was instrumental. He had gone to North Korea. He was looking at different ways to have a different relationship with North Korea. As a follow-on to that, the six-party talks went on, and at various times, I think in the first decade of the 21st century, mistakes were made, I think. So no, I do not think the sunshine policy was a mistake.
Actually, something bad happens on Korean Peninsula. We, realistically look at the policy of the U.S. At the beginning of the Obama administration, the U.S. appeared to choose engagement policy, but obviously last year there was the second nuclear test by the North, and then everything seemingly has been changed. Now the Obama policy is described as strategic patience rather than engagement. So I just wonder, what does strategic patience exactly mean?
Well, first of all, I think that it is very important for a country such as the United States that has a global responsibilities in terms of getting peace and stability to try different paths to try to get that peace and stability. So I fully agree with what the Obama administration was doing in terms of trying the diplomatic approach. I think the strategic patience is something that means that there needs to be a way of trying to figure out what is going on in North Korea, that we know that there is a succession process of some kind, and that time is not on the side of Pyongyang. And so our relationship with South Korea is a very important aspect and not just a confrontational policy. So that is what strategic patience is about.
Okay, but in that context, I read some interesting articles, especially from Washington Post. And some analysts worry that the Obama administration policy actually, allow Pyongyang to set an agenda. That means the U.S. and its alliances are just reacting to Pyongyang's actions. So partly as a result, there is a little opportunity to reduce the tensions or bolster diplomatic efforts. What do you think of that point?
Well, I think that what the U.S. administration is trying to do is to work in a way to lessen the problems on the Korean Peninsula, to work with our friend and partner, President Lee, to try to lessen the dangers, and that the hand is open to have discussions with North Korea, but also that it is important to react when there is something like the Chosun incident. So I think we are in support and working with President Lee.
Actually, this is just coming into my mind, when Secretary Hillary Clinton, was giving kind of tough messages to North Korea when she visited Seoul last month. And then so people say, okay, this reminds me of the days of Bush administration, which did take kind of hardline stance against North Korea. Obviously, his first term. Do you agree on that?
No, I definitely don't. I think that there are real differences. First of all, I feel very strongly about this, that when President Bush came into office, instead of picking up where the Clinton administration left off in terms of dealing with Kim Jong-il in some way to try to deal with the nuclear issue, there were discussions about the axis of evil and various aspects of it. The Obama administration was prepared to have a diplomatic approach with North Korea to figure out how to resume the six-party talks. And then what happened was the North Koreans were involved in this, according to the investigation, to this event with the ship and killing 46 Korean people. So what Secretary Clinton was saying was, in reaction to an incident, that it was unacceptable to have relations to go the other path. So it's very different. My sense about the Bush administration, it was just kind of lumping Iraq, Iran, and North Korea together because they didn't want to take the approach that President Clinton had taken.
Okay. Could you be very just direct question? When do you think the U.S. and North Korea have to have a direct talk? President Obama and Kim Jong-il.
I think that the North Koreans have to be willing to abide by the agreements that they made within the six-party talks of not threatening with their nuclear tests, and all the various Ambassador Christopher Hill made a lot of agreements. There had been a partial fulfilling of it when they dismantled the nuclear plant. Then they rebuilt things. So I think that in many ways the North Koreans have not met any of the conditions that they agreed to in the six-party talks. The United States, before the Chun events, was looking for ways that there might be some potential of bilateral talks within the six-party context, but the North Koreans have not been part of the six-party talks. So a lot is in, they have not lived up to their obligations.
So not yet?
No. I mean, the conditions don't exist for that at the moment.
I want to change some issues right now. There was an argument, the so-called, Japan passing, you do know well, in 1998. President Clinton visited China for 8 days, but not, even 1 day in Japan. So at the time, the Japanese government was worried about it. Last year, President Obama chose Japan as his first stop when he traveled to Asia. I think, the President Obama might be aware of that. My question is that what was Northeast Asian diplomacy in the Clinton administration, and can you compare to that of the Obamas?
I think that, first of all, I think that there was never any intention of Japan passing. I think that there were any number of times that President Clinton met with the Japanese. Either the Japanese were visiting us or we visited them. And the U.S.-Japanese relationship has also been a very basic part of American foreign policy. And so also what I think was interesting, and again, it's interesting how time passes very quickly in 20 years of policies. But President Clinton was working to improve relations with China. We were the ones that brought China, suggested that China be part of the World Trade Organization. But I think that the Obama administration has just come out with their national security strategy, very much on the same lines as President Clinton 20 years later, after 8 years of President Bush, of recognizing the importance of Northeast Asia to American policy, partnerships with the Japanese, with the Korean government, of trying to have a working relationship with the Chinese, of understanding the importance of this whole region. America is an Asian power as well as a European power, and so President Obama is building on the kinds of approaches that President Clinton had.
Okay. These days we are talking about G2 rather than G7 or G8. Regarding China, I think the policy in Asia nowadays defined as like a power of balance rather than the balance of power. So it seems the U.S. thinks that it has to coexist with China, avoiding some confrontation. Do you think the U.S. policy toward China actually has been changed in that way?
I think that what has happened, the world, we are going through a massive transition. As I said, this national security strategy that came out last week, the President and the Obama administration has made clear about the transitional aspect. And what I think is very important for people to understand is that President Obama has talked about more partnerships, cooperations, the importance of other countries being involved in trying to solve some of the problems that are out there, nuclear proliferation, climate change, piracy, a variety of issues. And China, everybody knows that China is a rising power. And so the American policy is to try to develop a sound working relationship with the Chinese in terms of their newfound power and global responsibility in dealing with all those issues. That's what's going on.
I think that you referred to the U.S. as indispensable country in the late 1990s when you was secretary. Is it still the case today? What kind of position actually does the U.S. have right now in the international community?
Well, let me explain what I meant. I have always believed that the United States needs to be involved internationally. When I talked about it in the 90s, actually President Clinton used the term first. I just used it all the time. I was primarily speaking to the American people that despite the fact that the Cold War was over, that the United States needed to be engaged because we are the major economy of the world and a powerful military country, and I believe an exceptional country. And so I still believe it. I believe that it is important for America to be engaged. Now, there is nothing in the definition of indispensable that says alone. It just means that we are needed to help solve some of the problems and to make clear that there's peace and our responsibility in terms of peace and stability. So I think all you have to do is look at what is going on anywhere, whether it's in the economic sphere or in the development sphere, or in dealing with conflicts, the United States, I believe, continues to be the crucial country with others. So I am very supportive of President Obama's national security strategy that talks about partnerships, because that is something that President Clinton talked about in the 90s.
I think this is my kind of favorite question. You've been all around the world, and then you met, all kind of people, and then you've been there to settle down some disputes or all kind of problems. How could you convince yourself to believe them, especially when you were meeting kind of hostile counterparts?
To believe what they were saying to me?
How could you believe yourself? How could you believe them, to do something in the direction you want?
Well, partially, it depends on what the issue is, but if you are going to be a good diplomat and a good negotiator, you have to put yourself into the other person's shoes to try to see what their interests are. A lot about diplomacy is compromise. And so what you try to do is to figure out whether you can have a win-win situation, and not to see everything in terms of zero sum. I win, you lose, because sometimes you can't get anywhere there. But you don't always succeed. I tried, for instance, to find some solution short of military force in the Balkans. We tried in a number of different negotiations to get Milosevic to understand that they had to stop ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. We couldn't persuade him, so ultimately we used force. But what I always tried to do was to figure out whether there was some way to find a solution short of force. But you have to try to figure out what is in the other country's interest. That's what diplomacy is about.
All the time this question kind of bothers me. For instance, I think it's related to your answer right now. The North Korea insists that there is threat by the U.S. Obviously it's their claim. So they say we need normalized relations. And then the U.S. want to nuclear-free peninsula, right? So both sides kind of don't trust each other. So the thing is, who's going to be the first? Who's going to make the first move? So in that case, how can you deal with these kind of issues?
Well, the United States, again, what happened, there's a long history, but in the 90s, when the North Koreans threatened to pull out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, we first started looking at whether there was a United Nations solution. Ultimately, what we did with very careful negotiations was to work out an agreed framework that recognized the fact that North Korea might have some energy problems. And the issue then was to provide them with light water reactors that in fact was done in coordination with the Korean government and with the Japanese government. The problem was then that the North Koreans broke the agreement. Partially they said that it all didn't happen fast enough. So we tried a different tack with them. I think that the real problem is that the North Koreans, for their own purposes, don't want to take yes for an answer because they have a different issue going on. This is my personal belief. You have a man who is a dictator, Kim Jong-il, who wants to stay in power and is using various parts of what he sees as threats to himself and exploiting that. I think it's unfortunate because the people of North Korea are suffering. There is a creation of uncertainty on the peninsula. But I think, and this goes back to one of your earlier questions, strategic patience, ultimately we have seen all over the world that systems that don't work collapse. That is what happened in the Soviet Union. That is what happened in Central and Eastern Europe. And a system that is irrational, that does not permit its people to exist at all and keeps them in poverty and bondage, ultimately will collapse. So the question is how it will disintegrate without creating more problems for Korea, China. So that it's a very complicated game, but ultimately, it is my belief, I have studied communist systems, that the system will collapse. It's irrational.
Some people have always questioned the role of the United Nations. I know you are a big fan of the UN, and then you were the ambassador. In some, the United Nations doesn't have any substantial power to resolve any problems. Do you agree on that?
Well, I am a believer in the UN, but I think the thing that people forget is the UN is composed of sovereign states. And while the people say the UN, it doesn't have power beyond what each state wants to give it and the political will of the states. And I happen to believe in multilateral organizations and the power of the UN, but it has to have the support of the countries, and once it has the support, then it creates a larger possibility. But the UN goes through its ups and downs. It's very interesting. You know, we are looking at the 60th anniversary of the beginning of the Korean War, and what really happened was that the Soviet Union had been blocking everything. The UN figured out a way to move things out of the Security Council into the General Assembly. The UN, in fact, was the organization that pursued the war, the UN command. So it's gone through a lot of ups and downs. I think the 90s was a very good period for the UN. When I was ambassador there was kind of the sense that there were so many things the UN could do. But it is only the sum of its parts. And if countries don't want to give the UN the support, it can't have it. I think Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is exerting very strong moral influence. He has made very important statements on climate change, on the energy crisis, on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But ultimately, it comes down to whatever the nation states. It's as I say, it's the sum of its parts.
Okay, I think that this is going to be the last question for today. Actually, there are lots of UN resolutions, especially, concerning North Korea. We had, 2 or 3 resolutions recently after the nuclear test by the North. Do you think, they have some effect?
I think that they are an expression of the will of the sentiments of the international community. But again, they have to be backed by national will. I think the UN continues to be a very important forum, and it expresses discontent by the international community over a fact. The problem, and you have come to this in many different ways, the issue is, what is it that brings change in the behavior of a country such as North Korea, where, in fact, there is a dictator who has a will to keep the country isolated. And the people are so poor and uninformed that they have no way of expressing themselves. But the bottom line is, what is it that would bring a change of behavior? And the truth is that we should not give up in trying to figure out how to change that behavior. But what has happened is Kim Jong-il has somehow developed, for the time being, a way of ignoring international behavior. But my sense is, because I think that there is change, as I said earlier, this is not going to go on forever. The question is now, how, in fact, to make it possible for there to be a change in which the people of North Korea have the capability of living a normal life. And the contrast between North Korea and South Korea is so stunning. When I flew from Pyongyang to Seoul, and you fly over North Korea, and there's not one light in the whole place, and then you cross the DMZ, and it's like being in a Technicolor movie. It is an example of the difference of people who live in democracy and those who live under a dictatorship that does not allow an expression. And ultimately, since I am an optimist, I believe that things will change, and it would be very important if they changed peacefully.
Okay, it's running out of time. Thanks for your time today.
Okay.
And I'm looking forward to meeting you in the future.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.